You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 254 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I got some stuff about the South China Sea, the Yemen war, which is an absolute disaster, and then some updates on Syria. For those of you who could take the time to share the show, it really does help and make a difference. So I appreciate if you could do that. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or libertarianinstitute.org. And at the Libertarian Institute, you can find my daily news roundup and the show, Foreign Policy Focus, right there on the right side of the homepage. So check out that site. There's a lot of good stuff up there other than my show and my content. And, click the share buttons from there. I recommend Twitter. I don't think sharing things on Facebook does very much anymore. And I'm actually, looking at moving more away from that platform myself. But not to stray too far from the topic of foreign policy, let's get into what's going on in the South China Sea. As I mentioned on the last show, there's some long-standing conflicts between China and its neighbors over territorial claims for the waters of the South China Sea. And the United States, being the global empire, has to involve itself in all regional conflicts, no matter how small or, little to do with the United States. But we have this one where, the United States doesn't have obviously any territorial claims. This is south of China. Several countries, claim territories in these waters. I think the United States claim is more or less that these should be considered international waters largely. I don't think I mentioned on last show a very important fact is that not just are these waterways important, as a lot of traffic, commerce moves through this region. If you're moving from, anywhere in the Indian Ocean, East Africa, the Middle East, and then going to, China's East Coast, up to Korea, Russia, Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, there's billions of people in this region. And so it's extremely important. And I'm sure, some commerce ends up going out, to the United States, and energy resources and, different stuff buried under the South China Sea. And so, having the territorial claims to these waters would be important, for China, the Philippines, Vietnam, whoever else, to be able to, mine or extract the oil or whatever else is under there. So the United States has long had this policy where what we call freedom of navigation exercises. We sail U.S., armed up Navy ships, destroyers and the like through the South China Sea, or fly our planes overhead in the air. And, this is seen as a maneuver, to say that, the United States has, the right by international law to sail our military ships through here. Now, I think China would argue that these are Chinese territorial waters, so no U.S. ships shouldn't be there anyways. My argument is it really doesn't matter who those waters are. There's really not a threat to the United States right now in the South China Sea. So what the hell is our Navy doing wasting my money out there anyways? But as I mentioned on the last show, I mentioned that the United States is going to go ahead and carry out a maneuver where they sail about 12 miles, I think, or so from some of these islands that are claimed by China as either economic or military, and then they're through the South China Sea territorial waters. The most recent time, when the United States was doing this just a few hours ago, I guess a Chinese, I believe destroyer, I think it was, an armed Navy ship, carried out some maneuvers around the U.S. ship. I think at one point, the United States claims the Chinese ship came within about 45 yards, of the U.S. ship. Now, of course, the U.S. Navy is outraged with this and saying, oh my God, look at how reckless, China is acting. And, typically that's the way they phrase those, maneuvers that the Chinese do. They say, Chinese, ships carried out irresponsible or reckless maneuvers around, U.S. ships. We've seen the same thing happen in the Persian Gulf, when the U.S. destroyers are getting, for say, too close to Iran. Iranian speedboats will come and kind of cut off the U.S. ships, and the United States always complains that Iran is carrying out these irresponsible maneuvers. We see this more aerially between the United States and Russia, especially in Eastern Europe. We'll have U.S. spy planes kind of flying along the Russian border, and then Russian planes will take off and then, come harass the U.S. planes. And, Fox News will air the footage of a Russian plane coming within a few feet. It is kind of scary to watch, how close it, maybe one bad gust of wind, and it seems like that would push the other plane to the other one. But, I'm not a fighter pilot or whatever. And, these seem like very dangerous maneuvers. And, it's always labeled as the other people, the Iranians, the Russian, the Chinese is doing something reckless and stupid. Now, it's never mentioned that, the location of this is never off the coast of the United States or in the air above Washington, D.C. and the East Coast of, the United States. When really, this is always right off, the coast of China and the Persian Gulf, right off the coast of Iran, and Russia, right off the Russian border, or right on the Russian border at times, they're flying these missions. And so I think that's an important thing to look at, when you see these stories come out. It's very rare that I see much analysis on this from anyone other than, just the one mainstream media source. CNN will run a story, Fox News will run a story about, so-and-so's planes or ships harass U.S. planes or ships. And then, it's really never discussed. And then you see an article a few, weeks later by a John Bolton or a Mark Thesson or Bill Kristol will start to complain about the reckless actions of the Iranians or the Chinese or the Russians as a reason the United States needs to take a more hostile stance against these countries. So it's kind of a shame that I think these topics aren't brought up in the mainstream media on the level of just looking at this one event and seeing what's happening here and pointing out to the viewers that, hey, this is a U.S. ship traveling halfway around the world, pretty much if you're looking at the South China Sea there. And, it's costing, I'm sure, millions of dollars to carry out this maneuver. At worst, it puts a lot of U.S. seamen in harm's way. I mean, we saw this, with the problems with the McCain and the Fitzgerald, that people end up falling overboard and actually dying from carrying out these maneuvers. And I think it's, just a very clear example of the United States putting our forces where they don't belong. The politicians who sit in D.C. With the highest level of protection, knowing that themselves and their families are not only safe, but wealthy for life, then go and recklessly stick U.S. airmen and seamen and our troops in all these countries and all these places where they don't belong. And it's just, it ends up being so dangerous and it's so expensive for the rest of us. And it doesn't help anything. Look, these maneuvers are not pushing China to adopt friendlier policies towards the United States. It's not like China is going to relent on the trade war because a U.S. Navy destroyer sailed through the South China Sea. What China is going to do is spend more money on their military so they could carry out more maneuvers like this where they harass the U.S. ships when they try to move through the South China Sea. They're going to spend more money building fake islands, or I guess man-made islands, not fake islands, out in the South China Sea and turn them into airstrips so that they would be able to maybe have air power buzz U.S. ships as they're carrying out these maneuvers. And it's not like any of this is going to be used in the world court. The United States isn't going to say, well, we sailed our ship through there every week, so that means that this is our territory. I mean, that's, just ridiculous. All right, moving on to what's going on in Yemen. We have Saudi Arabia giving $200 million, which, I mean, is just a drop in the bucket compared to what the Saudis and the Americans have spent on the Yemen war and their role in it so far. But this $200 million went to Yemen to prop up the central government of the country. I believe the Riyadh, which I think is the way you pronounce the Yemeni currency, has lost a lot of value. I think at the beginning of the civil war it was trading about 200 to 1 to the US dollar. It's now 1,000 to 1 to the US dollar. About halfway through this war, sometime in 2016, I believe, the Saudis pushed the Yemeni government to move the central bank of Yemen from the capital city of Sana'a, which was in Houthi-controlled territory, to the southern city of Aden, which was controlled by the Yemeni government. Prior to this, the Yemeni government was actually paying, I believe, even soldiers and, just civil workers in southern Yemen, in the government-controlled areas of Yemen, as well as paying, the government employees and I think even the soldiers in the Houthi-controlled areas as well. So really trying to stay impartial and making sure that a country which has a large dependence on the central government for income those people continue to get that money as things are going to get much, much worse. When the central bank was moved, the people of North Yemen stopped getting paid. This meant that, kind of civil duties were left undone. If you're a garbage man, you're unlikely to continue to do your garbage route for free. But even, if that's something that you wanted to do, it's likely that you had to go look for employment elsewhere because you're no longer going to get paid to be a garbage collector. So the garbage starts to pile up, and, you could use this example for whatever other government employee you want. Recently, there's been some protesting going on in the government-controlled areas of Yemen, specifically in the government-held city of Taiz, which is kind of on the front lines in central Yemen of the fighting. I find it kind of crazy that you have this situation where, the Saudis and the Americans and the Yemeni government claim they're kind of in the moral right and that they're the ones out to help the Yemeni people. But even people living on their side of the battle lines are suffering and protesting at the poor conditions that they live in. So it kind of shows that, I guess, first off, the Yemeni people might not be, kind of just in a utilitarian way better off under the Yemeni government versus the Houthis, but that even the people who live under the Yemeni government don't seem to necessarily want to be there. And of course, this is a side of the war the United States is supporting. So we'll see if that $200 million is enough to quell some protests and it's enough to stabilize the Yemeni currency a little bit. I'm sure the people in northern Yemen in the Houthi-controlled areas will continue to suffer. And I'll go into the famine situation we're looking at in a minute. So after some, feedback from a listener, I am making an effort to try not to use the word civil when I talk about the Yemen war. I think he's right in saying that, I think in part it takes away a lot of this responsibility that the United States bears for the war. And I also think it's just an incorrect label. That so much of the war is being driven by outside powers, particularly the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the Emiratis. That it's, time to just admit that, this isn't really just a civil war at this point. Jason Ditz at antiwar.com had a pretty good article out there about the amount of mid-air refueling the United States is doing for the Saudis since the start of the war. We've provided 93 million pounds of fuel. I believe that is like nearly 3,000 missions in total. And so we're doing an awful lot of supporting Saudi Arabia bombing Yemen, which is absolutely the worst part of this war. As bad as the fighting is, and the blockade is very ruthless as well, this air campaign has taken out a lot of the civilian infrastructure in Yemen. Schools, school buses, roads, bridges, hospitals, all this infrastructure has been destroyed. And the people in northern Yemen and in Yemen in totality are really struggling right now. I'm reading more articles that, the people of Yemen are just laying down dying now from deprivation. And it seems like, the UN is saying that the famine is imminent. And, if maybe by, good graces, the blockade is lifted tomorrow and the Saudis stop the push for the city of Hadada, maybe we avoid it and just skirt a little bit the famine in Yemen. But as I'm reading these stories, I'm seeing that, the Yemen's a very rural country, and the people, as Scott Horn points out, aren't living in refugee camps like they were living in Ethiopia. And so, you don't have these pictures of these mass number of kids starving to death together because they're all out in their own little villages scattered throughout Yemen, which is an extremely dangerous country. And again, under a complete blockade. When you look at journalists who have actually been able to report in northern Yemen, like Jane Ferguson of the PBS NewsHour, she actually had to smuggle herself across the front lines to get into Sana'a and the northern cities. The battle for Hadada continues to rage on. I think it was about September 9th or 10th that the fighting restarted. Kind of the situation that you had is the Saudis and the Emiratis put off the offensive for the city until after what they said, were going to be UN peace talks. I believe that the Saudis and possibly intentionally sabotage the peace talks by not guaranteeing the Yemenis would have safe passage to the talks. So you're not even allowing, your enemies, the rival party, to attend the talks. And so, you really are giving them no chance of working out. And so the Houthis withdrew from the talks. since they couldn't get there safely. And then the Saudis said, now we're going to take the city with the critical port that accounts for so much of the aid and the commercial food and fuel that enters Yemen. The fighting for the city right now is apparently very brutal. Lots of Saudi airstrikes going on, about 50 fighters killed in the past few days. It looks like Saudi Arabia has taken a portion of the highway that enters into the city of Hodeidah from the main Houthi stronghold of Sana'a. I'm guessing that this doesn't mean that the Houthis are now completely unable to resupply the city of Hodeidah, but I'm sure it does make it more difficult. The Saudi push continues from the south side of the city. They haven't taken the airport yet, which lies just south of the city. The actual port of Hodeidah itself, I believe, is really on the north end of the city. So, as people and analysts have put out who have talked about Hodeidah and how it's really going to be street by street fighting for the city as Saudi Arabia is able to take this city, we're going to see a lot of bloodshed on the Saudi way to that port. So hopefully continue to update the war in Yemen as it goes on. The United States could do a lot about it. We could shut this war down pretty quickly if we withdraw our support, including helping enforce the blockade and the mid-air refueling for Saudi Arabia. There is a resolution in the House promoted by, I think, the Democratic leadership. Even Adam Schiff, who I think is terrible on the Russiagate issue, gets this one right apparently now and is supporting a resolution H-Con Res 138. So if you happen to be talking to your congressman or whatever, mention this bill, tell them that they need a co-sponsor and support it. And this, would be the way, hopefully, to withdraw the U.S. support for Saudi Arabia and then end Saudi's air campaign against Yemen entirely. Syria. Read an article. Turkey is complaining that the United States did not fulfill their obligation per an agreement with Turkey to remove the YPG. That's a Syrian Kurdish militia from the city of Manbij. The city of Manbij in Syria rests on the west side of the Euphrates River. Turkey has long demanded that all Syrian Kurds must be east of the Euphrates River in Syria and have, pushed the United States, which bat the Syrian Kurds all the way to where, they're actually holding cities on the west side of the Euphrates River, pull those Kurdish forces back across to the other side. I thought that, I hadn't heard anything from this for a while and had assumed that, I guess, this issue with the United States and the Kurds and Turkey in northern Syria along the Euphrates River was resolved and that the United States had removed most of the YPG forces from Manbij and moved them back across the Euphrates River. One thing, that kind of makes it hard to predict why Turkey is making this claim now is there's just so many other issues going on between Turkey and the United States. There's the sale of the S-400 missile system by Russia to Turkey that the United States is protesting. Turkey is demanding that even though they're receiving these Russian missiles, that the United States still sell them the F-35s, that the United States is threatening to not sell Turkey. Turkey made a big stink at the UN, and Erdogan published an article that I actually talked about on the show in a past episode about how the UN needs to be reformed in the United States. And the rest of the Permanent Security Council members should lose their standing. And, Erdogan, I guess, visited Germany. I read that visit actually didn't go super well, but the fact that Erdogan went, I think is still quite significant. So, it's hard to say why Turkey is making this claim that the Kurds haven't left Manbij now. But it is something to keep our eyes on, just because Turkey has, threatened repeatedly to attack Syrian Kurds that are west of the Euphrates River, regardless if they're deployed alongside U.S. troops or not. I'm going to link to an episode of the Moderate Rebels podcast. I highly recommend all of you listen to this. It's hosted by Ben Norton and Mads Blumenthal. I think this particular episode, Ben Norton is the only host, and he interviews Asani, who I believe is at Asani22 on Twitter, on the Syrian civil war. It's fantastic analysis all the way through, and I don't want to, just kind of rehash all of it because I think you all should listen to the show. But I do think that the analysis on the Idlib province is really important. I just want to run through a little bit of it. Asani basically explains the deal that's going on that's halted the offensive as being in a very early phase, and there's still a lot of details to the deal to be worked out. From his perspective, it doesn't seem that he believes that Russia or Assad think that Erdogan could follow through with all the promises that he made in the agreement, to kind of control the Al-Qaeda rebels, to move them out of the Idlib province. And I really thinks that, eventually there will be at least some fighting in the Idlib province and that the Assad government will take that territory back. He says that Assad believes it's absolutely important to retake that territory and that Assad doesn't want to set the precedent that, Syrian territory can be lopped off by separatist groups. Especially if you look at what Turkey has done in resettling Syrian refugees in the area east of the Idlib province leading up to the Euphrates River. He does say it's possible that Turkey is somehow able to, work towards an agreement that ends up working out and we avoid fighting for the city of Idlib, which will be fantastic. There's a lot of people there. And as we've seen throughout the Syrian civil war, whenever you're fighting these jihadist rebels, a lot of civilians die along the way as you try to clear them out of areas. Asani also downplays the Iranian role in Syria. He explains that Iran was pretty important for the offensive against East Aleppo, but since then, Iran has actually been reducing support for Syria and kind of their deployment and footprint in Syria. And he describes how the situation on the southern border really worked out. That the pretense here is always that Iran is fighting in Syria as a threat towards Israel. But as we saw, there were a lot of deals able to be worked out in the reacquisition of rebel-held territory by the Assad government in southern Syria, and deals worked out between Russia and Israel and Assad for Iranian troops to not be part of those offensive and to be very far and stationed away from the border. So, I think this is a really important point raised by Asani, and it's also very problematic for the United States government, as we see time and time again that the war hawks in the Trump administration pushing for continued U.S. deployment in Syria and war with Iran keep saying how Iran is spreading their influence, creating the land bridge to Israel or to Beirut from Tehran, and all these other scary phrases that mean absolutely nothing. But Asani's analysis kind of flies in the face of that. So very important. And again, listen to that show. On the last show, I alluded to a bill, kind of having this reauthorization bill that ends up being worse than the original kind of law you have. And this is a FAA reauthorization bill. It's 1,200 pages long. This is important to foreign policy, I think, mainly because this reauthorization includes the creating of a Syrian study group, I believe it's called, and basically it's going to be a comprehensive review of the Syrian war. So it'll be interesting to see what they turn up. Maybe once that comes out, if it's not too classified and unreadable, I'll have a guest or two on the show and we could talk through that. Last thing on Syria, I'll note that the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which in the past I've criticized and point out how it is a very favorable group to the Syrian rebels, but at the same time they do put out analysis very frequently on the civilian death tolls in the Syrian civil war. And while I think those numbers can't always be relied upon as accurate, it is one of the few groups doing this work in Syria. They say that the death toll in September is the lowest it's been throughout this civil war, with only 138 civilians end up being killed. So that's a good thing to see, that the death toll in Syria and the fighting seems to finally be going down a little bit. And, maybe something could be worked out for Idlib, something could be worked out for the Euphrates Shield area of Syria, and then, an agreement could be reached between Assad and the Kurds, to just minimize the amount of fighting and destruction in a country that has seen so much over the past 7 years. All right, then a quick story on Iran. Iran fired a missile into Syria from Iran. The U.S. media really plays this up as just a show of force against Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States, which I'm sure in large part is, and that's why Iran carried out the operation this way. But the alleged target was a terrorist cell linked to the terrorist attack in Iran that killed about 24. I always just find it so interesting how much the U.S. media will downplay the fact that this Iranian missile killed a bunch of, alleged terrorists at least, when, if it's a U.S. strike, all they talk about is the terrorists and never where, it's hit on the map. But when it's Iran, all they talk about is, the location of the map and, what the strike itself meant. So, very disappointing coverage of this event as well. All right. I want to mention that Marco Rubio, along with two other senators, one I believe was Cory Gardner of Colorado, introduced the letter, or I guess published a letter demanding that Venezuela be added to the state sponsor or terror list. I don't know what kind of evidence you could possibly point to that Venezuela is a state sponsor of terror. I think Rubio's argument is pretty weak and claims that Venezuela is supporting the drug trade and that's somehow terrorism, which seems to be, importantly different from what, the idea of a terrorist is. And what terrorism is, especially the kind of terrorism that you would think of on the state sponsor terror list, Al-Qaeda types. But, it is important that, more hawkish, more of these very establishment players are all, encouraging more hostile U.S. policies towards Venezuela. Last thing, we have an Egyptian woman that was jailed for 2 years for posting a Facebook video where she kind of rants. I don't want to say rants, where she explains that she was sexually assaulted and then the Egyptian authorities did nothing about it. I think there's a couple important parts of this story. The first one is just that, Egypt is a U.S. ally and receives a lot of aid from the United States. However, it is a very totalitarian regime there, especially since there was a military coup in which, the leader of the military, Al-Sisi, seized power in the country and then held elections where he rounded up and arrested all of his main political opponents and won overwhelmingly. And so that goes to show that state, and that the United States, says, oh, we had to do something about the suffering in Venezuela. Oh, we had to do something about the suffering in Iran. But then if you talk about reducing military support for Egypt, everybody goes crazy and explains how it's going to be the apocalypse, even though, what we're doing is we're propping up a regime that oppresses women. Obviously an important point, just kind of the plight of women around the world and how, this is an obvious example of how in Egypt they just don't have the rights and, aren't valued as they should be, as a human being. But also this woman was arrested under fake news charges. And so I see a lot of people out there and who advocate for more government regulation of what fake news is and isn't, and, complain about Alex Jones conspiracy theorists and whatnot. And it's fine to, say that, this is a problem that people make up fake things and post them like they're real. But I think the problem is that if you give the power to the government to arrest people who are, carrying out fake news or whatever, it's not going to be the people who are actually making stuff up. It's going to be the people who are saying things and who are most critical of the government. All right, that's what I'll wrap up for today. ForeignPolicyFocus.libsyn.com. LibertarianInstitute.org is the best place to find all my work, including my daily news roundup and then my podcast there on the homepage. ImmersionNews.com is my personal news site. I really like the thing. I think all of you, if you check it out, you'll like it. It's one of those sites where you bookmark it. I update it a couple times a day with, all the latest news stories and most important things for y'all to read. Libertarian Union on Facebook at KYAAALE on Twitter. iTunes, Stitcher, all those podcatchers and all that stuff. It's there. Rating and review if you can. That does, help in rankings or whatever the hell. And then, check out, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. And, there you could donate to the show. I really appreciate for all of you who do that. It helps me to upgrade the show and make it better. All right. Thanks everyone.